Cool. Um, Hi, I am Waiter. I am here to just give a quick history of feminism. So, why am I probably the person to give you this particular lecture? Um, it's because I'm a wannabe feminist historian. So I'm basically here to regurgitate a lot of the things that my professors have already said, but basically a lot of the things that I have learned in the history of feminism has been really, really useful, especially in debates about feminism. Quite straightforwardly, um, as a feminist historian, like I think that I have read quite a bit, especially on like different contexts of feminism. I have used a lot of this spec knowledge in debates. Gotten an A, right, for the history of feminism. But also it translated to like pretty good scores, especially in social justice movement rounds. But also, um, I guess as a side note, I have won a major in emotion on social justice movements and how they have moved across. I think that it's just significantly easier for me to talk about social justice movements at a point that I'm using feminism as a baseline. So I guess it's like a dual function thing. Like take it as like this lecture um focuses on feminism, but a lot of the concepts that will be talked about in this lecture can be pushed towards general social media. It's not social media, blah, like social justice movements and like social justice movement motions. So it's a feminist, it's a history of feminism lecture that's also doubling as like a social movement lecture. I think that a lot of these ideas will be quite transferable. So I will have in-text citations because and I have a bunch of works cited because I hope I'm not talking out of line or spreading fake news. So this is also non-comprehensive, so I am genuinely very sorry if I missed out on something. This lecture will then be split in three parts. The first is the problems with feminism. The second will be the broad um problems within feminism. The second is how we have worked, how solidarities within feminism and how we have actualized those things. The third will be on trans feminism and queer feminism and how those two movements actively contribute to our understanding of social movements as a whole, and also wrapping up the things I've discussed in the first two things. So let's get right to it. What is feminism? It is the mobilization of people through shared identity, but specifically through gender. So this already clues into you the fact that they might differ, right? Because there is, broadly speaking, a mobilization of people through the shared identity and struggles of gender that I've already placed on the slide. This just basically means that like there is just our general understanding of what feminism is now is just like we band together and to do something about to do something. And what bands us all together? Gender, right? So, or like feminine identity, for example. So, feminism specifically, then becomes like very, like, and as this lecture will show, quite diverse, right? Because like what is a unified feminine identity is probably not something that we can answer very, very cleanly, but how we mobilize and why we mobilize also becomes extremely, extremely diverse. So the question to what is feminism, oftentimes it has just me going like which one, right? Like which form of feminism, like why like do we consider some of these people feminists, right? Because like feminism itself like has a different like historical baggage depending on which locale you're looking at. There are many people we consider feminists that we would consider feminists in status quo that don't that have self-proclaimed and self-identified themselves to not be feminists. So this lecture will probably also tell you why they do those things, but just basically just keep this in mind, which is feminism and most social movements is just broadly speaking the mobilization of individuals through a shared identity. In this particular lecture, gender. Cool. Oh. So, context of feminism. So, many different feminisms, i.e., that like depending on where you look at, they're just very, very different social backgrounds that also that tell women what they want, right? And women want different things in different places. I know this sounds very straightforward, but the main problem is that especially in the field of feminist history, the reason why we write about women's experiences is because men were often seen as just extreme movers of change, while women were passive actors of history. To like explain this a bit further, the reason why feminist history or even like feminist studies came up as like an academic subject to begin with was because like many women were like, look, we are looking at history right now, and it seems to us that it's primarily driven by men. So men run the world, men did things, and men enacted change in the world. The problem seems to be that like women were just written out of history, right? Women didn't contribute to the world, women did, or if they did, were often relegated to like a side note, right? Of like women did things. So what happened essentially is that within feminist uh, feminist academia then arose as a result in places like the UK and the US, especially in the earlier 20th century, which specifically wanted to reintroduce women's experiences, i.e., that women were able to enact change, women were not passive actors, as what Rose talks about. And this is why specifically much of feminism then actualized as a result. As you will see later on, the many different feminisms is a relatively newer concept, i.e., that like women knew that like different women wanted different things, but how they saw this particular idea was drastically different. And I'll explain this now. So, what were the problems with feminism as a term? So, give me a minute to like scroll my notes. On a basic level, like we're just very, very bad at identifying what is different about certain social movements and how they conceive femininity, right? So the term feminists have often been rejected by people that we would deem feminists because that term has drastically different social meanings in the past than it does right now. So for very good reasons too. So for example, colonialism in India, where suffrage was very, very complex and carried with it very different nuances. So Indian suffragettes, for example, positioned themselves as imperial citizens versus national citizens. So there was a big divide within the Indian feminist movement as to whether suffrage was something which was particularly important within India. So the right to vote, right, was something that was heavily disagreed on within India. Why? Because the women who wanted like the right to vote, for example, were heavily associated with the colonial government. So they had close ties, they were often extremely educated, they were of a higher caste. The problem is that there were many, many other feminists, for example, nationally speaking, who didn't necessarily agree with the fact that like suffrage would be super liberatory, right? Because a lot of the women who were like advocating for the vote were extremely privileged, for example, but also there were things like, for example, caste issues, right? Like would lower caste women be able to vote, for example, became the kinds of like concerns which like actualized, I guess, within like a lot of these national, like within these national feminists. So there was a large divide between like feminists who wanted the suffrage vote, but and also within like the feminists specifically who like were advocating for other things, like maybe like for caste freedom, for like mobilization against the colonial rule, for example, was particularly important. Keep in mind as well that this was within World War One. Like this was also when women were actively and when women were also participating actively within wars and therefore wanted more recognition of their like participation within wars. So particularly like context of colonialism, context of nationalism, context of war becomes very, very intertwined within the feminist movement within India. This is also why many women, especially who were quite prominent within like the Indian feminism, oftentimes like explicitly said that I do not want to be labeled a feminist, because to be labeled a feminist at that point in time was to also like align yourself basically with like an ideology that they necessarily might not agree with. Cool. Do I have anything more? Right, yes I do. One more thing as well is that many people in developing in not really the developing world per se. I guess some people call it third world feminism, but like I don't like that term. But third world feminism, right? Often reject the term feminist because it implies a West and then the rest narrative. The idea here is that feminism specifically is often like seen as a more Western thing, but the term itself also came from like a French what's that word called? Conference, right? So specifically, I think it was the term feminisme, right? I'm butchering the term, but like that's fine. essentially. And a lot of like the bedrock for like collective action, especially under this particular term, was quite French and was quite like colonial in nature. So, i.e., many academics believed that like pre this, that the feminism didn't really exist. Here's the problem, right? Which is which is why you can like see quite clearly why there are some people who would reject this term, is that like, but gender movements particularly still existed before this term. The problem with saying that like gender movements didn't exist before this term is to suggest that like a lot of these like gender movements in places, especially in Asia and in regions of Africa, for example, right? Like just didn't do anything. And that makes very little sense to me. So that's also why many people reject the term feminism, i.e., that like they were just like it doesn't encompass like the larger scope of gender movements specifically that existed, and oftentimes this term carries a very large amount of baggage. Some of this baggage has been removed now and it has become rather uncontroversial, but it's never always been this way, is basically what I'm telling you. So then you're like, so why do I care about what you just said? So over here will be like the densest part, I think, of the lecture. So if you want debate stuff, I think this is probably where you should perk up your ears. So I think this also means that when you see the feminist movement, like there are just many movements, and the term itself is a historically and contextually contingent one, right? So there were many movements, and you just cannot take for granted specifically that like when the motion says as the feminist movement, that you can just go, that feminist movement, right? There needs to be a lot of like explanation as to why specifically this feminist movement, why specifically we ought to focus on this version of feminism, why what is the goals of feminism as well cannot be taken for granted and must be outlined very clearly to the judge. But also you then need to contend specifically with why your version of why this of feminism then becomes the way in which the judge should like evaluate your claims, right? So let me see, what did I oh yeah, so the intuition is this, which is what you think is important in the feminist movement, it might just not be important to another person. So, for example, I'm like, so like I'll consider myself a feminist. I grew up in Singapore, right? So, but a lot of like Singaporean feminism is centered specifically around impositions of the state, like things like, for example, certain policies that have been passed by the government, which in the past, like that can be construed as sexist, right? That can be construed as state control of feminism, etc., etc. So a good chunk of like feminist literature by Lenore Lyons, for example, chats about why like Singapore feminism is specifically Singapore feminism, the limitations of like state control, why state control is particularly quite can be quite oppressive in the past and to some degree in the present as well, right? But meanwhile, like another feminist, for example, in places like Ghana, might be focusing more on the environment, right? Because of women like Wangari Maathai, because much on the liberation movement that specifically was rather gendered, especially within the Ghana liberation movement, right? Like these are just two different sets of beliefs, and we might both identify as feminists, but like they just cannot be homogenized, especially within one idea. This applies to your debates as well. Cool. The second thing I want to immediately point out is that the feminist agenda is also often dictated by people in power as well. So both locally and internationally. So think about like again suffrage, right? We focus so much on who got suffrage first, New Zealand, by the way, that we neglected a lot of like the other kinds of problems which plagued other women, right? So think about the suffrage movements, for example, which like we place a lot of emphasis on, which is like, wow, guys, women got the ability to vote, and that's a very important thing, right? But we neglected like a lot of the other problems which were plaguing feminist movements. So yes, New Zealand did indeed get the right to vote, but like the right to vote was also specifically heavily gendered, i.e., that like Maori women, for example, were the last to get the vote, right? But white New Zealander women were like the first to get the vote, for example. So getting the vote in and of itself was a complicated problem. things like, for example, domestic abuse within New Zealand, for example, were way more prominent issues than like whether were also quite not way more prominent, but were quite prominent big issues, right? That specifically existed within these places. Going back to India, for example, right? That like caste discrimination and caste separation in India, for example, right, was also a very, very big reason as to why suffrage like wasn't like to many, many individuals something that was a big focus. So this is particularly important, I think, because this also highlights to you again, right? Like, excuse me, why like feminism but also femininity is also then drastically different between contexts as well. This is, again, particularly important in contextualizing, framing, and characterizing feminist movements. So, oh yeah, the last thing as well, which is like a quick, like a quick add on to this, is that the state also then plays a part in how feminism, but also femininity comes about. Clothing, for example, becomes used as a gendered discourse about modernity in places, in various places. I think Ghana was one of them as well. Again, I'm using a lot of the examples I got from my historical readings, which is like specifically the idea that like things like miniskirts, for example, were co-opted by the feminist movement within Ghana because miniskirts were seen as like comfortable, modern, right? But also had a drastically, but was also like seen as like a sexualization of women within Ghana. But so women taking up arms for the state, right? Like so posters of like Chinese posters of like Chinese progress, especially if you look at like often highlight what it means to be a woman of the state. So like many Chinese propaganda posters oftentimes had women driving tractors with like a bunch of babies running around them, right? Which highlighted like what the state viewed as like the ideal woman, right? She is not only industrial, but she's also someone who like takes care of children, for example. But this is again historically contingent, right? In terms of like the moving towards like a greater future, which was like the main crux of like the Chinese progression movement. So all of these things again are just particularly why like the term feminist is just very extremely historical, contextually contingent one, heavily diverse, cannot be homogenized, and like but a lot of the ways in which we view these things are also directed by power and context. That is to say that what we deem as important in the feminist movement also then is determined by by power sources. And I'll be elaborating more about this later. So I think the question then that many people ask is like, so if it's so diverse, then like what is the feminist movement, right? That means that like that maybe later that like it was like we just didn't work together, right? Maybe like we should just all like separate and do nothing. Not really. It wasn't all that bad. Like I think that specifically, we worked together quite well-ish. What I'm saying is this. Wait. Oh yeah. So the question I get a lot is like, so like why did women work together if they were like so different? So the first thing is quite like there's a few things, right? The first thing is that they wanted to exchange information. So like for example, in Ghana's 1960 conference on Pan-Africanism, like there was a lot of like African American delegates who came over to like chat about anti-colonialism, about how feminism was particularly important to them, about how the feminist movement was often heavily was often neglected colonial aspects of liberation, for example, and this has to be taken into account at a point where like regions like Africa and Asia were heavily colonized, for example. So there was a large exchange of like exchange of knowledge and inflows of knowledge, but also participation, especially in international forums. Two, you're also able to ask for resources and protection. So Wagari Matai, very cool environmentalist. Go Google her, read her memoir. Super amazing woman. Basically protested on the streets against against Ghana's against like basically the state basically wanting to bulldoze like public parks and public reserves. So she was one of the few people who single-handedly saved like Uhuru Park, for example. So places like the United Nations, right? So you were able to ask for resources and protection. So in the case of Wangari Maathai, she was like she was able to get like basically a good amount of international support in order for her to travel outside. So there was a concern as to she became a security concern in Ghana precisely because like she was participating in a lot of like protest movements, for example. So what the international community did was to just be like, cool, we want her at this academic conference. Please let her go. And they were like, well, we can't like if we basically stop her, we are looking super undemocratic right now. So essentially, she like the international pressure, specifically from like places like the United States, for example, allowed her to travel quite freely, especially within allowed her to travel quite freely, right? Especially in a context that was not very particularly fond of her moving. The third, I think, is that the where was it? Oh yeah, they wanted to just fight against things like colonization. God. So the Afro-Asian Conference in 1958, for example, allowed women to like corroborate their story. So it's like the first point that I had was that like it was information sharing, right? Like we are doing X, we resist in Y way, like resisting in Y way works in some places but not others. We want to like have like manifestos, for example, that are created for like unified purposes. The last point I'm making here is that like it also allowed women to gain like a feminine identity, a feminist identity, right? I.e., that the Afro-Asian Conference in 1958, for example, allowed women to allowed women from both Asia and Africa to corroborate a lot of their stories of colonization and how it impacted women specifically. This meant that they got a significantly higher amount of traction, especially when talking about things like colonization, because otherwise they would have been very disparate contexts, right? In terms of like and would have been very hard to collectivize against the narrative of like colonization initially. Therefore, the ability for them to come together and say that we shared like a colonizer or like we shared like colonized experiences, and those things were particularly like very very bad to us, also allowed for people to like realize that like a lot of the things that they were facing were quite bad, right? And allowed for them to also form solidarities with other women. And these solidarities are quite important, especially when not just, I guess, international collectivization, right? But also in terms of like putting international pressure onto countries to do things, right? In terms of resistance, right? Like in terms of like getting education, for example, were all ways in which political participation and mobilization for women specifically, and why it's particularly important. Cool. Here's a few things to note, however. The first is they work together, yes, but this was also quite complicated. Women who were socialists, for example, and who contributed to the Women's International Democratic Federation, or the WIDF, were often sidelined as Cold War shills because the Cold War politics meant a very harsh delineation of women, especially within these countries. So oftentimes people especially people from the West, or often painted socialist women or women who came from like places like China, for example. Was it? No, it wasn't Zimbabwe. It was. It could have been Zimbabwe, right? I cannot remember. Like Bellows Blakely basically like talks about like how certain socialist women, for example, were neglected, especially in feminist history, because they were like, well, you are from X country, surely you are a shill of the state, and like the feminist movement here was just like nothing more than state propaganda, for example, right? So a lot of the movements and especially like the achievements of like these women were lost, but also a lot of the resistances against like the state, right, was also lost as a result. We are also just very bad at, I guess, identifying like the differences between the feminist movement and the state. Like it tends to be like a large discrepancy, right, between the way that we see the state and the way that the feminist movement actualizes. What I'm suggesting is this, that many people often see like the feminist movement, especially like in the past, in like the 80s and 90s, in academia as like, oh, these brainwashed women, right? Like who are like part of the puppets of the state. But it's also like a lot of the feminist movements within these states were also very important in like being somewhat anti-state. So like many of these women were advocating for things like, for example, like the abolition of foot binding, right? Like which clearly it's also like an anti-state, like to some degree an anti-state narrative, right? So Dorothy Ko, I think, does a very, very good job in terms of dissecting it in her book, a Cinderella Story, I think, right? Which talks about how like the diminishing, especially in the of the the laws of foot binding, for example, and like and like the outlawing of foot binding, for example, was also a very important like pushback against the state that many people just often neglect. Cool. So after all this, you're like, thanks, waiter. I don't care about this. How can we use this in debate? Okay, so this is the part I think that most of you would listen to, right? So, one, teens, me included, often glitch out when they are talking about feminist movements because we fail to recognize certain contexts. Remember that what a feminist movement is, or this house as the feminist movement is always a bit of a trap because, like, guys, again, they want different things. So, who is this feminist movement? Which context would this be useful? Is very, very important. So, the motion. This house, as the feminist movement, will deprioritize centralizing men over fighting for equality. So, here's the thing. Immediately, if I look at this motion, I have to dig my brain in terms of like which context would decentralizing men or like essentially fighting for equality be more pertinent, right? For which group of feminists? Because like if, for example, in this, oh yeah, before that, things also like teams also struggle to tell me why we need to unite. So I will hear a lot of the times, especially in like feminist rounds, we need to unite for something. This fractures the feminist movement, and I'm like, yes, cool. The feminist movement has never always been united or fractured. It really depends on the context. Like abstract terms like fracturing and coming together, like tell me nothing about like the feminist movement and why we need to do X and why prioritize X, right? So it's maybe probably important for us to push for the continued like cooperation of like feminist organizations. For example, so this house as a feminist movement would prioritize decentralizing men over fighting for equality. So decentralizing men, right? Like probably will be in context of the feminist movement, like which has a high like locus of control, especially within male-dominated institutions. So we would do things like, for example, this probably exists within places like, for example, like certain religious states maybe, right, where like a large portion of like control has been centralized not only religiously but has also bled down to many forms. We think that decentralizing men involves things like, for example, actively campaigning against them, like actively running for positions that are like being usually predominated by men, right, over fighting for equality. So maybe within this context, like fighting for equality might look like, for example, like constantly asking for equal pay, right? Like constantly doing like constantly asking for equal pay, constantly asking for like equal amounts of rights accorded to these individuals, maybe like so do you realize like so my thing is this, that this particular motion is pertinently important in terms of A, identifying what decentralizing men looks like, because it can look different depending on which context, but B, in terms of like the comparative of fighting over equality becomes a lot more delineated as a result at a point you realize that the feminist movement can technically do both, but it's also just takes a lot of resources to do both, and therefore like it's very difficult to do so. So this is why we need to acknowledge differences and work together. Like this is why we need to acknowledge specifically like the different contexts of feminism in order to make this argument, for example. The second motion I have is this house as the feminist movement opposes female influencers from using an idealized family life as the main source of content. So this house as the feminist movement opposes female influencers from using an idealized family life as the main source of content. So if I was the op team, I wouldn't just stop at like this fractures women, right? It is that female influencers also often weaponize choice feminism to split the feminist movement up. So in response to like the fact that like family channels, like in response, so the first thing I'll probably do is I'll just be like, yeah, like these like family channels are quite bad. Usually like people self-select for themselves, like there's often already a high incentive to like not to avoid threadwife TikTok, for example, right? Because like a lot of these things are heavily counterintuitive towards the average woman, for example, right? Like most women are like most women, especially like in both developing and developed countries, like are already like fighting for independence. They are generally quite independent. Like most people like autonomy. Like these are all things which like actively act as active checks and balances already. But I'll further like the context can further this, right? Which is that like these women in threadwife TikTok or like often legitimize their harmful content by suggesting that any attacks towards them would be anti-feminist, right? And to go against them will be a deprivation of choice. So like this particularly heightens the conflict between various feminists because like this legitimizes the kinds of really bad behavior, right, that the threadwife like TikTok is trying to promote. Because the way it exists is through like a martyr effect, for example, right? Which that threadwife TikToks often respond to comments which bash them because look at these women who claim themselves to be feminists but are going against us despite us like trying to have a callback to femininity, or like I thought you were for pro-choice feminism, right? That means that like you women are just being actively anti-woman. You are being a horrible individual, right? This also means that it's easy to paint incoming feminists or like current feminists as extremists who are out to deprive women choice, right? But it also means that we when we don't engage with them, we give them significantly less ammunition to bash the movement because they are unable to capitalize on outreach, which deprives them of like getting any more outreach, i.e., that women specifically who like are on the fence, maybe, right, of like of seeing this as an appealing form, actively don't get like more basically like roped into this. Give me a minute. Let me don't get actively roped into this. B, that it's basically like we don't and B, we get significantly less engagement on threadwife TikTok, and therefore this deprives them of a major way they make revenue. Give me 2 minutes while I plug in my laptop. Yeah. So this is also why teams like like just knowing the fact that different feminisms and knowing how feminisms were actualized within these areas, A, helps you find like which context of feminism will the motion require, but B, also allows you to just pinpoint a lot harder as to what the actual concrete impact will be. So it gives you a lot more concrete illustration, specifically within these motions. Cool. Next slide. Next concept then I want to introduce is agency. So this concept is quite simple. What is agency? This might surprise you. Again, linking back to the initial context I talked about earlier, is the fact that women did things, but they didn't just do things randomly, they adapted and changed according to their context. So they are often not abject victims of circumstance. What I'm saying is this, that many women took opportunities when they could in order for them to gain more ability to make choices for themselves and choices for other individuals. So most feminists, I think, define agents, or most feminist historians define agency as basically the scope of ability for you to do things, right? So this exists on a spectrum. So like, but the most important thing I just need you guys to remember is that agency is not black or white. A woman is not just agent or not agent, right? Like a woman is like, and this just goes for most social movements in general, right? Like a woman doesn't have like most people don't have unlimited choices, right? But even if you're very very privileged, excuse me, but also most underprivileged women were also not like totally devoid of any kind of life whatsoever, and they did nothing, right? Like so rich women, like rich privileged women, were also often constrained by like their circumstances, right? Like the need for marriage, for example, right? Are still things that plague them. Women in like lower, like women who might get the like might be poorer, who might be people of color, for example, are often still having a lot of agency, like they did things, right? So an example of this is probably like slave owning in Ghana in 1807. So like Kwabena Adubowen like does a very good job in terms of like explaining how in 1807 women owned slaves with the advent of legitimate commerce. So transatlantic slave trade, slaves are being traded across the world. With the advent in 1807 of legitimate commerce, basically, Great Britain outlawed explicit slavery. So, like, the exports of slaves became lower, but internal circulation of slaves became higher as a result because the supply of slaves internally became a lot higher, which dropped the prices of slaves. Women then capitalized on their paramours, marriages, social connections to gain autonomy for themselves, which means that many women then utilize this drop of price, for example, to like buy slaves to like help work in the sugar farms, for example, or to help like grow agriculture, to do household chores. So it's particularly important, I think, that women weren't passive receivers of like context, but actively tried to make their lives better, right? Like I think another example I can think off the top of my head is like I think it was Fox Amato, I think, which talked about their girl types specifically. So it's not a feminist thing per se, but like many slaves often took pictures of themselves, or they were like the girl types are just like an old kind of picture, right? And these pictures are particularly important because like they had very heavy symbolic meaning, right? So you might be a slave, for example, but you owned your own image, right? And like when most of your parts of yourself have been sold off to like, you know, a like a white dude, right? Like when your sexual freedoms, your freedom to move, right? Like your like when heavy amounts of abuse have been inflicted upon you, and like there's just a lot of and like a lot of your agency has been deprived. People still did things like again take pictures, right? Just to remind themselves of like the ownership of that they have over their image, for example, to place themselves as equal to their slave masters, because most of the time pictures were like only available towards like slave masters, right? So which meant that like owning a picture of yourself like was a way in which people like put themselves equal to right their masters, at least in their minds. So these are all ways in which agency actualizes themselves. So this is particularly important, I think, because and you might be asking again, waiter, you have been yapping about agency. Like, do I care about this? The answer is probably. So like you're like I know you're like, oh my god, like you've been just yapping a lot about agency, but why is this important in debate? When we talk about debates which talk about the focus on the feminist movement and terms of like this house believes, so and what the direction of the feminist movement in terms of like what we ought to spotlight, right? So as the feminist movement, we should focus on positive improvements made by women versus the problems that women are currently facing. This is quite useful, right? Because the kinds of messaging specifically the feminist movement is always trying to do is usually towards a direction of restoring agency, right? So but it's also just, I guess, important as well that restoring agency also includes trying to get buy-in towards certain policies. So, i.e., the debate that particular motion is about which like basket of things paints women as more able to like, do we prioritize the fact that women were able to do things, right? And us doing like, so on both sides of the house, women will be doing things, right? So like we on the former, we'll probably emphasize like the successes of women, right? Like women like who have done like major changes within the world, for example. On opening opposition, I mean, if you're on opening opposition or just opposition in general, you probably focus on the fact that like they're on the ongoing movements, right? The women who are still protesting and what they're protesting for will be highlighted. So these two things, right, are not necessarily diametrically opposed. You probably will do both, but like the important thing about recognizing that agency is particularly important as a concept allows for you to draw the distinction as well in terms of like why a particular form of taking action is maybe ensures more agency or like deprives agency or like paints women in a particular way which prevents people from wanting to join the movement, for example. So for instance, in spotlighting positive change. On Gov, they will probably run it. This is particularly important because women have done good things with their lives and have contributed to this. On the counterfactual, it seems like women will then always be on the back foot and victims of patriarchy. But the odds push then is to flip this, right? Surely that when we highlight the struggles of women and their ongoing pushes, it allows for people to see the fact that women not only are doing things, but have a reason for why they're currently doing things. Maybe the context is that people are just woefully unaware of what's currently happening in the third world, for example, right? Which is why we need people to have which again links back to the first part of the presentation, which is that many women in general are very unclear about what the third world wants. Many of us default to generalizations that are honestly in debate quite equitable, right? When we debate about third world women. So, and places in the third world, for example. So, we oftentimes need to just be significantly more cognizant, right, of what women are doing right now to feel sympathetic to their cause and get people to join the feminist movement. So realize that both teams want women to join the feminist movement, right? And both teams probably are advocating for a version of women that does things. But the question then becomes whether which side is able to maybe garner more feminist and support for feminism, for example, right? Maybe either side just wants to have a more accurate representation of history, right? In terms of whether we really have done a lot, especially within these contexts, for example, and whether that's particularly true, or whether we get too complacent, for example, right? So I think that oftentimes we just assume that women just already I think oftentimes so basically at the end of this particular part of this presentation, it's just that understanding that women and most social movements in general focus on what they were able to and not able to do enables you to tackle on social movement motions which talk about what the queer community, the feminist movement, for example, BLM, for example, and what they should do and what what they should do in terms of messaging, in terms of how people will often react to these kinds of messagings, etc., etc. Cool. So, on to one of my favorite pet topics, trans and queer feminism. So, differs from context to context. Often, the main, I think, assumption is that many people believe that the trans movement, specifically within the UK, for example, are diametrically opposed to the feminist movement in the UK, but that's not true. The author that I've cited specifically talks about how trans feminism in the UK has been existing ever since 1980s and has shaped feminist discourse. Many trans women were heavily involved, for example, within feminist spaces. Many people were determining whether these women were often discussing the legitimacy of these particular women. What was a woman, for example, at a point if you're pre-transition, do we allow you into feminist spaces and into women's spaces? The kinds of conflicts, for example, between trans women who did manage to get a higher form of education because they were assigned male at birth and transitioned later on in life, were all things I think which is discussed in places like trans feminism. But another thing as well that trans feminism spotlights is the fact that trans feminism doesn't actualize the same everywhere, right? So Semela, for example, which is a trans man within India, writes about the fact that there are many local terms in India that refers to gender variant individuals. So Hijra, Tirunagai, Kina, Mangalamukhi, Aravani, Koti, Jokpa, Shiv Shakti, Tirunambis, and Baya and Bayan. These are these 8 categorizations are not things which the average Western trans individual might think about, but also then suggest that the trans experience is just significantly more diverse than we would like to think they are, right? So this house, as the trans community would accept X, needs to take into account the fact that many of these movements were just heavily interconnected. Cool. And you're why do I care? This has nothing to do with debate. Boo. Haha, psych. No, right? This clearly has something to do with debate. One, especially when talking about interrelations between queer movements in relation to other movements, or just movements interacting in general, like there needs to be, I think, a clear understanding in terms of like the problems that exist when interacting between these different movements, right? So respectability politics, for example, or passing privilege specifically exists quite heavily within the UK context, right? Especially if you read the paper. So for example, trans women who passed were allowed into feminist spaces, but like required things like medical, like proof of medical transition. In places like Tivaga, for example, you could in Tamil Nadu in South India, to access trans networks and to be adopted into like trans women networks. In the past, you had like in like 2007 or 2008, I think, like you had to like have proof of medical transition. So a lot of these things are kind of important, especially when we talk about like interrelations between like when motions are like this house as a trans movement would like do would separate themselves from the feminist movement, or like this house as like the feminist movement would actively do X for the trans movement, for example. Like I see a lot of these kinds of motions like hovering around. Like there's just a diverse amount of incentives that exist between other movements. Keep in mind that all the things I've talked about in the first two claims in terms of like power and agency are just particularly important as well when talking about trans feminism, right? Like this is a very important like example, I think, in terms of like and it's a good summary to wrap up the previous concepts, because one, oftentimes like the people who dictate trans feminist discourse are also women who are able to do things like pass, for example, right? Have a higher level of education, right? But also like who dictates like what we believe to be transness, or like or like the terms we use in the vocabulary we use, right, are also heavily neglected and determined by powerful institutions. The kinds of like feminine like the kinds of like gender categorizations I talked about in gender variance are just not exactly something that the average person will know. And the reason for that is because these things are often not very spotlighted, right? And they're often a lot weaker, for example. So there just needs to be like a lot more clearer like understanding in terms of like the incentives of these people. I think I might be running out of time, but basically, to summarize, right? I think it's particularly important to remember that women, especially feminism, is heavily like, and what feminism is not only extremely diverse, but it's also placed upon by power structures in general. The way we understand feminism differs from context to context, is informed by things like colonization and wars, which some countries have and some countries don't, in terms of like the baggage that they have, right? Whether it's determined by class, by context, etc., etc. The implication of this in debate is quite simple. It is that when you see motions that generalize the feminist movement, or that like or who talk about like I think one of the World's motion was like we would support state feminism, for example. This is at a point, that as the queer movement would like use state imagery and would participate in state narratives. Like these are the kinds of things that you need to talk about in terms of like why specifically of A, what the feminist movement is and how we perceive it, B, what it ought to be, and C, like why does this affect the kind of women that we're talking about. The second push then is that like in agency, right, which is how do we like what is the best way to remind ourselves that women did things, right, and which narrative of women doing things is important, but also that the way that we see certain women doing things, like whether we whether certain contributions of women doing things were has historically been quite neglected, right? That like of course there's like the general examples of like people like scientists like Marie Curie, for example, but there's also just like an important like it's just important to remember, I guess, that women doing things is just not, and our acknowledgement of women doing things has been extremely recent. Like we are not very good at identifying women like who have made changes and contributions towards like life in general. The last thing is that intersections between various movements are always important, and differ and are subject to the first two like points I've talked about, right? So again, trans feminism, trans community are not only often extremely interlinked, but are also subject to the same kinds of like understandings and power dynamics and understandings that we currently have right now. So these are the three broad things I wanted to cover in this particular lecture. So I was like, I didn't want to do like feminism 101, like what is intersectionality kind of vibes, because like those things can very easily be found online. Like, what is intersectionality? Like the idea that like your identity, like you have a unique experience if you have compounding social identities. Like these are things that you can probably find TED Talks on, right? Like you can probably find like most like a lot of these things are rather more intuitive, and the average debater, the middle tier debater will probably know. Like if you've been debating for like half a year or a year, like these are concepts that you would probably be exposed to. I wanted to give like a feminist lecture which was like a bit more in depth, that has a bit more academic rigor, and in terms of like giving just examples and context, and maybe inspiring some interest, I guess, in terms of like researching the context of the things I talked about today. So thank you so much for this. I hope that you guys found this lecture useful. And yeah, goodbye.